George Strait sees a blind 8-year-old boy at the traffic light. What he did impacted everyone. The Nashville sun seemed especially cruel that July afternoon. The relentless rays reflected off the hot asphalt, creating heat waves that distorted the vision of those passing through the busy Broadway Avenue. For most drivers, it was just another scorching summer day in Tennessee. But for Miguel, a small 8-year-old boy, it was the 5th consecutive day he ventured between the stopped cars at the traffic light. Miguel couldn't see the sun beating down on his fair skin. He couldn't see the indifferent glances of drivers as he moved from one car to another with his white cane. His eyes, hidden behind worn-out dark glasses, had lost their ability to perceive light 2 years ago, when the rare degenerative disease he was born with completed its ruthless course. What the boy couldn't see with his eyes, he made up for with sharp senses and an uncommon determination for someone so young. Tissues! Tissues! Only $2! His childish voice was almost drowned out by engine noise and honking horns. Miguel held the small, colorful packs tightly in one hand, while the other gripped the cane as if it were his anchor in a sea of metal and urgency. The heat made sweat drip down his forehead, occasionally mixing with discreet tears. He struggled to hold back. It wasn't the time to cry. Every dollar he earned meant one more step toward saving his mother, toward keeping them together. The hospital bill was growing daily, just as the eviction deadline was quickly approaching. You too can make a difference in a child's life. Sometimes a small act of kindness is all someone needs to keep going. "Hey kid, get out of the way!" a driver yelled as Miguel, disoriented by the heat, stumbled slightly in front of his car. The boy stepped back, startled, his heart racing. He was used to indifference, but hostility still caught him by surprise. A few blocks away, in a busy recording studio in the heart of Music Row, George Strait was wrapping up another exhausting session. The king of country had spent the last 8 hours recording tracks for his new album, a special project marking 4 decades of his career. At 73, George still carried the same elegant presence and unmistakable voice that had made him a living legend of American music. "I think we're done for today, folks," he said, removing his cowboy hat to run a hand through his graying hair. The producer nodded in agreement, satisfied with the recorded material. "Your car's waiting outside, George," said Mark, his manager for over 20 years. "We have that meeting with the label execs at 5, then the charity dinner." George simply nodded, tired. He still loved music like on his very first day, but the endless meetings, appearances, and side obligations wore him down more each day. Sometimes he wondered when he'd be able to just play and sing without all the strings attached to fame. The black limousine waited at the studio's back entrance, away from fans and photographers. Jack, his driver of over 15 years, opened the door with a familiar smile. "To the label office, Mr. Strait?" "Yes, Jack." "And crank the AC. This heat is brutal today." As the luxurious vehicle glided through traffic, George closed his eyes for a moment. He was exhausted, not just from the physical strain of a recording day, but a different kind of fatigue that had been building for years. Since his wife Norma's death 3 years ago, something had been missing in his life. Music remained his refuge, but the loneliness weighed heavier and heavier. Lost in thought, George barely noticed when the car stopped at a red light on Broadway Avenue. It was only when he half opened his eyes that he saw, through the tinted windows, the small, staggering figure among the cars. At first, the singer thought it was just another child asking for money, something sadly common in big cities. But there was something different about this boy. The dark glasses, the white cane, the cautious way he moved, and most of all, the dignity with which he offered his tissue packs instead of simply begging for money. "Jack, who's that kid?" George asked, leaning forward in his seat. "Looks like a blind boy selling something, sir. I've seen him around here the past few days." George watched with growing concern as the boy was nearly hit by a car. that took off abruptly. No one seemed to care. Drivers swerved around him like he was just another obstacle, no more significant than a traffic cone. "Stop the car, Jack," George said suddenly. The driver looked in the mirror, surprised. "Sir, stop the car. That boy shouldn't be alone in the middle of traffic." Mark, engrossed in his tablet reviewing the day's schedule, abruptly lifted his head. "George, we're already late for the meeting with the label. Then there's the charity dinner where you're the guest of honor." "The meeting can wait," said George with that calm determination everyone knew well. When the king of country spoke in that tone, there was no room for argument. Jack parked the limousine in the first available spot, and George opened the door before the driver could get around to do it for him. "Wait here," George instructed. "I'll be back in a few minutes." While Mark protested inside the car, George crossed the street toward the traffic light. The merciless sun hit him full on, making him squint. He wasn't used to walking under that blistering heat without his hat, which he had left in the car. Miguel had just been ignored by yet another driver when he sensed someone approaching. Years living in darkness had sharpened his other senses. He could detect the firm but cautious footsteps, the faint smell of a subtle men's cologne mixed with leather. "Hey, partner, what are you doing out here alone?" The voice that reached him was deep, kind, and carried an unmistakable Texan accent. Miguel jumped slightly in surprise. Few people stopped to talk to him, and when they did, it was usually with pity or impatience. This voice was different. It held genuine kindness. "I'm selling tissues, sir," the boy replied, extending a pack toward the direction of the voice. "I need to raise money for my mom's medicine." George looked at the brave little figure and felt a lump in his throat. There was something in the boy's face, maybe the way his chin lifted with determination despite the circumstances, that deeply moved him. "How much for each pack?" George asked, pulling out his wallet. $2, sir, but they're good quality tissues, I promise." George smiled at the little salesman's business-like seriousness. "I'll take them all. How many do you have?" Miguel's face lit up in surprise and disbelief. "All of them? I have 15 packs, sir." "That's $30, George calculated, handing over two $20 bills. "Keep the change." Miguel's small hands trembled as he received the money. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." His voice cracked slightly. George noticed the light was about to turn green, and the boy would remain in danger in the middle of traffic. "What's your name, partner?" "Miguel, sir. Miguel Oliveira. Nice to meet you, Miguel. My name is George." The singer deliberately left out his last name, not wanting to draw attention. "It's really hot out here. What do you say we get some ice cream at that diner on the corner? You can tell me more about you and your mom." Miguel hesitated. He had learned not to trust strangers from a young age. His mom had made that very clear, but there was something different about this man. His voice conveyed a sense of safety Miguel rarely encountered. "My grandma says I shouldn't go places with people I don't know," the boy murmured. George smiled, admiring the boy's caution. "Your grandma is absolutely right. What if we call her? You can tell her where you are and ask for permission. The diner is right there on the corner, a public and busy place." Miguel bit his lip, considering. "Actually, my grandma thinks I'm at the social program near home." He lowered his head, ashamed. "She doesn't know I come here to sell tissues. She'd be really worried." George immediately understood the complexity of the situation. The boy was hiding this from his grandmother, putting himself in danger in heavy traffic to help his family. That said a lot about the desperation they must be living in. "I understand," George said seriously. "So here's what we'll do. That diner over there is full of people. It's safe. We can talk inside where you won't be at. Risk among the cars, and then I'll take you wherever you want." "How does that sound?" Miguel seemed to consider it for a few moments, nodding slightly. The scorching sun and the fatigue from standing for hours were beginning to take their toll. "All right," he finally agreed. I'd really like some ice cream. It's really hot today." George offered his arm. "May I help you cross the street?" Miguel nodded, taking the offered arm with one hand while firmly holding his cane with the other. Together, they crossed to the sidewalk and walked the short distance to the corner diner. Across the street, Mark watched the scene with growing impatience, repeatedly checking his watch while muttering about commitments and ruined schedules. Jack, the driver, watched silently, a small smile of admiration on his face for his boss's gesture. Neither of them imagined that this casual encounter between a country music legend and a blind boy selling tissues at a traffic light would forever change the course of many lives, especially George Strait's own. The bell above the door of Joey's diner jingled cheerfully as George held it open for Miguel. The contrast between the scorching heat outside and the refreshing air conditioning inside made the boy sigh with relief. The diner was a classic Nashville establishment, with red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floors, and walls adorned with signed photographs of country music stars, including several of George Strait himself. "Find us a quiet booth in the corner, Sally," George said to the middle-aged waitress, who recognized him immediately, but maintained her professional composure with nothing more than a surprised widening of her eyes and a discreet nod. "Right this way, Mr. Sir." She caught herself, understanding George's subtle headshake. Miguel's cane tapped rhythmically against the floor as he followed the sound of George's footsteps and the gentle guidance of the waitress. When they were settled in a corner booth away from curious eyes, Sally handed them menus. "What would you like, Miguel?" George asked, then realized the boy couldn't read the menu. Before George could correct himself, Miguel spoke up. "Could I have a chocolate? Sundae, please, with extra chocolate sauce if that's okay." There was a hesitant hope in his voice, as if expecting to be told it was too expensive. "One chocolate sundae with extra sauce for the young man," George confirmed to Sally, "and just a coffee for me, Black." As the waitress walked away, George studied the boy sitting across from him. Under the diner's lights, Miguel looked even smaller and more vulnerable than he had on the street. His clothes were clean but visibly worn, his sneakers nearly falling apart at the seams. The boy's fingers nervously played with the edge of a napkin, folding and unfolding the corner with mechanical precision. "How long have you been selling tissues at that intersection, Miguel?" George asked gently. "5 days now, sir," the boy answered. "I made almost $70 so far, counting today." George felt his heart constrict. $70 after 5 days standing in the scorching summer heat. "That's quite impressive," he said, keeping his tone light. "You must be a good salesman." A hint of pride crossed Miguel's face. "I try to be polite and remember to thank people, like Mama taught me." When the Sunday arrived, Miguel's face transformed. The restrained, serious expression gave way to childlike wonder as the rich scent of chocolate reached him. George watched as the boy carefully explored the dessert with his spoon, mapping its contours before taking the first bite. The smile that followed was radiant. "This is the best sundae I've ever had," Miguel declared, after savoring that first spoonful. As Miguel enjoyed his ice cream, George gently steered the conversation toward the boy's situation. Bit by bit, Miguel's story unfolded between bites of sundae and occasional sips of water. Miguel's mother, Elena Oliveira, had come from Brazil 7 years ago, seeking medical treatment for her son's rare degenerative eye condition. She had started as a cleaner at a local hotel, then added shifts at a restaurant and weekend house. Cleaning jobs. Despite her exhausting schedule, she always found time to read to Miguel and help him adjust to his progressively worsening vision. "Mama says that even though my eyes don't work, my ears and my mind work extra good to make up for it," Miguel explained proudly. "She got me piano lessons last year from Miss Jenkins, who lives in our building. She only charged $5 per lesson because she said I have a aptitude." He struggled slightly with the word. "Aptitude," George supplied gently. That means you have natural talent. Miguel nodded enthusiastically. Yes, that. Miss Jenkins says I have good ears for music. I can hear a song once and then play it. Not perfect, but pretty good. George was genuinely impressed. That's a special gift, Miguel. The boy's smile faded slightly. We had to stop lessons when Mama got sick. Her kidneys don't work right anymore. She's been in the hospital for 3 weeks now. Elena's kidney disease had progressed rapidly over the past year, becoming critical 3 weeks ago when she collapsed at work. Since then, Miguel had been staying with his grandmother, Rosa, an elderly woman with mobility issues of her own, who did her best but couldn't watch the active boy every minute. Abuela tries, but she gets very tired and her legs hurt a lot, Miguel explained. She thinks I go to the community center every day, but they closed for repairs last week. That's when I had the idea to sell tissues. A boy at school said his cousin makes money that way. The medical bills were mounting. Their apartment's rent was 3 weeks overdue, and the medication Elena needed was only partially covered by the emergency medical assistance they'd qualified for. Miguel had overheard his grandmother on the phone, crying about possibly losing their home. I just need to make enough money to help until Mama gets better, Miguel said with the simple certainty of a child. She always takes care of everything. She just needs a little help right now. What about your father? George asked carefully. Miguel's face hardened in a way no 8-year-olds should. He left when the doctors said I would go completely blind. Mama says he wasn't strong enough to handle it, but that she's strong enough for both of us. There was a matter-of-factness in his voice that broke George's heart. As they were finishing up, the diner's door swung open forcefully. A red-faced man in an ill-fitting suit stormed in, followed by a uniformed police officer. Both scanned the restaurant until their eyes landed on Miguel. There he is, the man in the suit pointed. That's the boy who's been begging in traffic all week. George watched as Miguel tensed, recognizing the voice. I wasn't begging, Mr. Fuller, Miguel said quietly. I was selling tissues. The man, apparently Mr. Fuller, scoffed loudly as he approached their table, the officer following behind. Operating an unlicensed business, endangering traffic and truancy during school hours. Your grandmother's already been notified, boy. George stood up, his imposing height and dignified presence immediately commanding attention. Excuse me, who exactly are you? The man seemed momentarily startled by George's intervention, but quickly recovered. Douglas Fuller, Department of Children's Services. And you are? A concerned citizen, George replied evenly, deliberately avoiding giving his name. I found this young man in a potentially dangerous situation and brought him here to make sure he got something to eat while we sorted things out. There's no need for this confrontation. The social worker looked George up and down, taking in his expensive boots, custom belt buckle, and the quiet authority he projected. Something in Fuller's expression shifted from righteous indignation to cautious assessment. Sir, with all due respect, we've received multiple reports about this minor endangering himself in traffic. His situation at home is already under investigation. Miguel's hands began to tremble. Please don't take me away from Abuela, he whispered. I just wanted to help Mama. The police officer, who had remained silent, now spoke with unexpected gentleness. Son, we're not here to hurt you or your family, but standing in traffic is dangerous. You could have been hit by a car. George placed a reassuring hand on Miguel's shoulder. Officer Mr. Fuller, surely we can discuss this like reasonable adults without frightening the boy. Fuller's face reddened. This isn't about being reasonable. This is about following protocol. I've been monitoring this situation for weeks. The mother's hospitalized indefinitely. The grandmother is physically unable to provide adequate supervision. And now the child is found endangering himself. My job is to ensure his safety. By traumatizing him in public, George countered. his voice steady but with an edge of steel that had everyone in the diner turning to watch. Fuller puffed up. "Do you have any idea what kind of liability the city faces if this blind kid gets hit by a car while selling tissues without a permit? Not to mention the mother allowing an 8-year-old with a disability to live in substandard conditions. The hearing's already scheduled for next week." "Hearing? What hearing?" Miguel asked, panic rising in his voice. The social worker seemed to take a certain satisfaction in explaining. "A hearing to determine if you should be placed in temporary foster care while your mother's situation is evaluated." The chocolate sundae that had brought such joy minutes earlier now sat forgotten as Miguel's face drained of color. George felt a protective anger rise within him, the kind he hadn't experienced since his own son had been bullied in school decades ago. "Officer," George addressed the policeman directly, "I'd like a moment to speak with Mr. Fuller privately, if you wouldn't mind staying with Miguel for a minute." The officer nodded, seemingly relieved not to be in the middle of the brewing confrontation. George guided the protesting social worker to the counter, away from Miguel's acute hearing. "Mr. Fuller," George began quietly, "I understand you're doing your job, but surely there's a better way to handle this situation. Regulations are clear," Fuller began, but George cut him off. "I'm George Strait." The social worker's mouth snapped shut, eyes widening in recognition. "Yes, that George Strait," George continued. "Now, I don't want to make a scene or pull rank, but I'd appreciate it if we could approach this situation with a bit more compassion and a lot less bureaucracy. That boy is trying to help his sick mother the only way he knows how." Fuller's demeanor changed instantly, the way it often did when George revealed his identity. It was precisely why he rarely did so. "Mr. Strait, sir, I had no idea. I'm a huge fan. My wife and I saw you in concert back in '98 in Houston." George nodded politely, but firmly steered the conversation back. "About Miguel? Yes, well, protocol still requires—" "Protocols are guidelines, not prison sentences," George interrupted. "Surely there's room for human judgment. What's really needed here is support for the family, not separation." As they spoke, the diner's door opened again. An elderly Latina woman with a walking cane entered, her face etched with worry. Her eyes landed on Miguel and filled with relief that quickly transformed to concern when she noticed the police officer. "Miguel, Dios mío," she called out, making her way slowly to the booth. "Abuela!" Miguel's face brightened with recognition at his grandmother's voice, then crumpled with guilt. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you." Rosa Oliveira caressed her grandson's face with trembling hands. "Why, Nieto? Why did you lie to me?" The social worker called, said you were in traffic. "I've been so worried." "The community center closed, Abuela. I wanted to help Mama. We need money for her medicine and the rent." Tears finally broke through the brave facade Miguel had maintained. George watched the interaction, noting the deep love between grandmother and grandson despite their desperate circumstances. He also noted Fuller observing the scene with clinical detachment, mentally building his case for family separation. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Fuller seemed determined to make an example of this case. The grandmother was clearly overwhelmed, and Miguel sat trembling between them, a child bearing adult burdens. George knew he needed to intervene decisively. The country singer approached, the table again, this time extending his hand to Rosa. "Ma'am, my name is George Strait. I met your grandson today, and we've been talking. I'd like to help, if you'll allow me." Rosa looked at him with confusion. "George Strait, the singer Elena loves so much." Her voice carried the same slight accent as Miguel's. Miguel's head snapped up. "You're George Strait, the real George Strait. Mama has all your records. She plays them all the time." George smiled gently. "Yes, that's me. and I'd be honored to help your family through this rough patch if you'll let me." Fuller cleared his throat loudly. "Mr. Strait, while your concern is admirable, this is a matter for the department now. The hearing next Monday will determine—" "The hearing will determine nothing," George interrupted with quiet authority, "because by Monday there will be no case to hear. Officer," he turned to the policeman, "is Miguel being charged with anything?" The officer shook his head. "No, sir. We were just responding to concerns about a minor in traffic." "Then I believe he's free to go home with his grandmother," George stated plainly. "And Mr. Fuller, I'll have my attorney contact your department tomorrow morning to discuss this situation properly. I'm sure we can find a solution that keeps this family together while ensuring Miguel's safety and well-being." Fuller sputtered, caught between protocol and the influence of the celebrity standing before him. "This isn't how procedures work." "Sometimes procedures need to adapt to human realities," George replied firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe Miguel and his grandmother could use a ride home." The social worker looked like he wanted to object further, but seemed to think better of it. With a curt nod, he placed his card on the table. "This isn't over. I'll expect to hear from your attorney tomorrow." With that, he turned and left, the officer following after giving Miguel a small, encouraging smile. As Fuller's rigid form disappeared through the diner door, George turned back to find Miguel's face filled with awe. "My mama is going to be so excited when I tell her I met you," the boy whispered, a glimmer of childlike excitement breaking through the worry that had dominated his expression. "You're her favorite singer in the whole world." The late afternoon, sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as George's limousine pulled up to the modest apartment complex in East Nashville. Mark, his manager, had been calling non-stop since George abandoned their schedule, but the singer had silenced his phone after briefly explaining he was handling a personal matter. "This is our building," Miguel said as Jack parked in front of a weathered three-story structure. Despite its age and evident maintenance issues, the small garden patches near the entrance had been lovingly tended, with bright marigolds and zinnias adding splashes of color against the faded brick. "Thank you for bringing us home, Mr. Strait," Rosa said, her voice thick with emotion. The grandmother had been quiet during the ride, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, overwhelmed by the day's events and their unexpected encounter with her daughter's musical hero. "Please, call me George," he replied warmly, "and I'd like to come up for a moment, if that's all right. I think we should talk more about how to handle this situation with the Social Services Department." Rosa nodded, leading the way to the building's entrance. The elevator was out of order. "For 3 months now," Miguel explained matter-of-factly, so they climbed the stairs slowly, accommodating Rosa's arthritic pace. George found himself impressed by how effortlessly Miguel navigated the familiar space, his cane sweeping confidently before him as he counted the steps under his breath. Their apartment on the 3rd floor was small, but immaculately clean. What it lacked in space and modern amenities, it made up for in thoughtful touches. Tactile markers on appliances for Miguel, family photos covering the walls, and a small, upright piano in the corner of the living room that had seen better days but appeared well-loved. "Please sit. Make yourself comfortable." Rosa gestured to a worn but clean sofa while she disappeared into the kitchen to prepare coffee. George noticed how she winced slightly with each step. Left alone with Miguel, George watched as the boy made his way to the piano, his hands finding the keys with practiced ease. "This was my grandmother's piano in Brazil," Miguel explained. "Mama paid extra to bring it when we moved here. She said some things are worth the sacrifice." Without preamble, Miguel's fingers began to dance across the keys, playing the opening notes of George's hit "Amarillo by Morning." The rendition wasn't perfect. Some notes were missed, the timing occasionally off, but the natural talent was unmistakable, especially for a child who had been playing less than a year. "Miss Jenkins says I have good relative pitch," Miguel said as his fingers continued moving. I can hear a song and find the notes pretty quick. Mama says it's a gift from God to make up for taking my sight. George sat quietly, genuinely moved by both the boy's talent and his matter-of-fact acceptance of his circumstances. When Miguel finished playing, George applauded softly. That was impressive, Miguel, truly. The boy beamed at the praise. I want to learn all your songs. Mama plays them all the time when she cleans houses. She says your music makes hard work feel lighter. Rosa returned with coffee for George and milk for Miguel, along with a plate of homemade cookies. As they sat together in the small living room, she began filling in more details about their situation. Elena Oliveira had been a music teacher in São Paulo before Miguel's diagnosis required specialized medical care only available in the United States. She had sold everything, obtained a medical visitor visa, and brought Miguel and Rosa to Nashville, where a renowned specialist practiced. They had planned to return to Brazil after treatment, but when Miguel's condition worsened and his father abandoned them, Elena made the difficult decision to stay illegally, working whatever jobs she could find to support her family. She worked so hard, Rosa said, her eyes misting. 3 jobs, sometimes 4, always putting money aside for Miguel's education, for his music lessons. She never complains, never takes a day off. Then her kidneys started failing 6 months ago. The situation had deteriorated rapidly in the past 3 weeks. Elena's kidney function had dropped to dangerous levels, requiring dialysis 3 times a week. Without insurance, they were accumulating massive medical debt. The hospital was providing emergency treatment but couldn't offer the specialized care Elena truly needed. The doctor says she needs better treatment, maybe even a transplant someday, Rosa explained, her voice breaking. But without papers, without insurance, we pray for a miracle. George listened intently, his mind already working through potential solutions. Which hospital is she in? Vanderbilt University Medical Center, Rosa replied. They've been kind, but there's only so much they can do for someone without insurance. George nodded thoughtfully. I'd like to visit her, if that would be all right. Miguel's face lit up. Really? Mama would be so happy. She knows all your songs. We could go now, George suggested, checking his watch. Visiting hours should still be open. For the first time that day, George saw genuine hope flash across Rosa's tired features. She would be honored, Mr. Strait, truly honored. Within 30 minutes, they were walking through the gleaming corridors of Vanderbilt University Medical Center. George had called ahead, not to arrange special treatment, but to ensure his presence wouldn't cause a disruption. The last thing Elena Oliveira needed was her hospital room turning into a fan circus. They found Elena in a shared room on the nephrology floor. Even lying in a hospital bed, connected to various monitors and looking exhausted, Elena Oliveira radiated the same quiet dignity George had observed in her son. Her eyes, identical to Miguel's in shape and color, widened in disbelief when George Strait walked into her room behind her son and mother. "Mama! Mama!" Miguel rushed to her bedside, his cane tapping excitedly. "You'll never believe who I met today. It's George Strait, the real George Strait." Elena's gaze darted between her son and the country music legend standing awkwardly by the door, holding his hat in his hands. "Miguel, what are you talking about? How would you—" Her voice trailed off as recognition dawned. "Oh my God, you really are George Strait." George approached her bed with a warm smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Oliveira. Your son is quite an extraordinary young man." Elena's hand flew to her mouth in shock, then quickly moved to smooth her hair, embarrassment flooding her features. "I'm sorry. I must look terrible. I don't understand. How did you meet Miguel?" Over the next hour, they explained everything. Miguel's secret tissue-selling operation, their chance encounter, and the confrontation with the social worker. Elena's face crumpled with worry when she heard about the scheduled hearing. "They want to take him away," she whispered, reaching for Miguel's hand. "No, they can't. He needs to be with family. I'm getting better. I'll be out soon." The monitors beside her bed betrayed her agitation as her heart rate increased. "Elena, please calm yourself," Rosa urged, stroking her daughter's arm. "Mr. Strait has offered to help us." George pulled a chair closer to Elena's bed. "Miss Oliveira, I'm not exactly sure how I can help yet, but I promise you this: I won't let them separate your family. Whatever it takes." Elena studied his face, searching for sincerity. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her. "Why would you do this for strangers?" It was a fair question. George considered it carefully before answering. "I've been blessed with success beyond anything I ever imagined," he said finally. "But lately I've been feeling disconnected, going through the motions. Your son reminded me today of what really matters." He glanced at Miguel, who was exploring the various machines around his mother's bed with curious fingers. "His courage, his determination to help you, it touched something in me." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "He is my miracle. Every day he amazes me with his strength." "He told me you love music," George said, deliberately lightening the tone. "He even played one of my songs for me earlier." Elena's expression transformed, pride momentarily overshadowing her concerns. "He has such a gift. Even his teachers in Brazil noticed it before his vision began failing. The way he can hear something once and play it. I tried to keep up his lessons here when I could afford them." As if on cue, Miguel turned from his exploration. "Mama, did you know Mr. Strait has a ranch in Texas with horses? He told me all about it in the car." George watched as Elena's face softened with her son's excitement. Despite the gravity of their situation, she made space for his joy, a testament to her strength as a mother. A nurse entered the room to check Elena's vitals, doing a double take. When she recognized George, to her credit, she maintained her professionalism, only a slight tremor in her voice betraying her surprise as she addressed him. "Visiting hours end in 15 minutes, sir," she informed them after finishing her checks. George nodded in acknowledgement before turning back to Elena. "Miss Oliveira, with your permission, I'd like to have my personal physician come see you tomorrow. Dr. Roberts is one of the best nephrologists in the country. He's treated me and my family for years." Elena's brow furrowed. "I appreciate the gesture, Mr. Strait, but we could never afford—" "Please," George interrupted gently, "let me do this. Consider it an advance on Miguel's future piano concerts." He winked at the boy, who beamed in response. After a moment's hesitation, Elena nodded, too exhausted and worried to refuse help that might improve her condition. "Thank you." As they prepared to leave, Miguel leaned over to kiss his mother's cheek. "I'm going to play for Mr. Strait again tomorrow, Mama. Maybe he can teach me more of his songs." "I'd like that," George said sincerely. "In fact, I have some studio time booked tomorrow afternoon. Maybe you'd like to come see a real recording studio." Miguel's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? A real studio where you make your records?" "The very same," George confirmed, enjoying the boys' excitement. After saying their goodbyes, George drove Rosa and Miguel back to their apartment. In the car, he made several phone calls, first to Dr. Roberts, explaining the situation and arranging for him to examine Elena the following day. Then to his attorney, briefly outlining the issues with the Department of Children's Services. And finally to Mark, his manager. "Mark, I need you to clear my schedule for tomorrow," George said firmly when his manager answered. "George, be reasonable. We've got the label executives expecting you, the publicity photos for the new album. Reschedule it all, except the studio time. And that will be a private session, no label people." "What's going on, George?" Mark demanded. "This isn't like you." George glanced at Miguel, who was describing to his grandmother in excited detail what the inside of a limousine was like. Let's just say I've found something more important than another meeting about album marketing strategies. Back at the apartment, Rosa invited George in for dinner, but he politely declined, promising to return the next morning. As he was leaving, Miguel tugged on his sleeve. "Mr. Strait," the boy's face was solemn. "Are you really going to help my mama get better?" George knelt down to Miguel's level, though the boy couldn't see him. "I'm going to try my very best, Miguel. That's a promise. And will you really teach me more songs?" "Absolutely. We country musicians have to stick together, right?" Miguel's serious expression broke into a wide smile. "Right." Later that evening, alone in his penthouse apartment overlooking the sea, Nashville skyline, George sat with a guitar in his lap, idly strumming chords. His phone had dozens of missed calls, from Mark, from the label president, from the charity gala he'd missed, but he couldn't bring himself to care. For the first time in years, George felt a sense of purpose beyond the next album, the next tour, the next award. Meeting Miguel and his family had awakened something that had been dormant since Norma's passing. A desire to make a direct, meaningful difference in someone's life. He thought about Miguel's talent, about Elena's struggle, about the system that seemed designed to separate families rather than support them through hardship. Somewhere in those thoughts, a melody began to form, and George found himself reaching for a notepad, scribbling down lyrics for the first time in months. As midnight approached, George made 2 more calls, one to his longtime friend who served on Vanderbilt Medical Center's board of directors, and another to an immigration attorney who had helped one of his band members' families years ago. He didn't know exactly how yet, but George Strait was determined to change the Oliveira's fate. He had made a promise to a blind boy who sold tissues in the scorching sun to help his mother, and George intended to keep it. The next morning dawned bright and clear. George arrived at the Oliveira's apartment building at 9, as promised, surprised to find Miguel already waiting outside, dressed in his best clothes, a slightly too small button-up shirt and neatly pressed pants that had been mended multiple times. "I've been ready since 6, Miguel announced when George approached. "Abuela said I was driving her crazy with my pacing." George laughed, feeling lighter than he had in months. "Well then, we'd better get going. We've got a busy day ahead of us." That day marked the beginning of a whirlwind week that would change the trajectory of multiple lives. George brought Miguel to the recording studio as promised, watching with quiet delight as the boy's hands reverently touched the grand piano in the corner, a Steinway that had been used on countless hit records. "It sounds different from mine," Miguel observed after playing a few experimental notes. "Deeper, like it has more stories inside." George's band members, initially confused by the presence of a blind child in their closed session, quickly warmed to Miguel's earnest questions and obvious passion for music. By the afternoon's end, the bass player was showing Miguel how to feel the different vibrations of his instrument, while the drummer taught him a simple rhythm pattern. "Kid's got perfect pitch," the keyboardist commented to George. "You don't see that often, even in professionals." Throughout the session, George kept checking his phone for updates. Dr. Roberts had seen Elena that morning, and George was anxiously awaiting his assessment. When the call finally came, he stepped outside the control room to take it. "George, I've examined Mrs. Oliveira," Dr. Roberts began without preamble. "She's in stage 4 kidney disease, approaching end stage. The current treatment she's receiving is minimal at best, enough to keep her alive but not addressing the underlying progression." George's grip tightened on his phone. "What does she need?" "Ideally, specialized medication that's not covered under emergency care, possibly a transplant. Down the line if things don't improve. But there's a more immediate problem. The hospital is planning to discharge her tomorrow since they've stabilized her immediate crisis. Without proper follow-up care and medication, she'll be back in emergency within weeks, and each episode causes permanent damage. They can't just send her home like this, George protested. They can and they will. It's standard procedure for uninsured patients. Once the emergency is addressed, they're discharged. George paced the hallway, mind racing. What if money wasn't an issue? What could be done for her? And there was a thoughtful pause on the line. With proper resources, we could get her into a specialized treatment program, manage the disease more effectively, possibly even delay or prevent the need for a transplant. But George, we're talking about significant expenses for someone without insurance or legal status. Make it happen, Doc, George interrupted firmly. Whatever she needs, whatever it costs, I'll cover everything. And after ending the call, George leaned against the wall, processing the implications of what he'd just committed to. He wasn't naive about the cost. Specialized medical treatment could run into hundreds of thousands of dollars. But when he thought of Miguel's determined little face as he sold tissues in dangerous traffic to help his mother, the decision felt unquestionably right. When George returned to the studio, he found Miguel sitting at the piano, playing along as the band worked through one of George's older hits, The Chair. The boy had picked up the melody perfectly after hearing it just once, adding his own simple but complimentary left-hand pattern. "Mr. Strait," Miguel called out when he heard George's footsteps. "Your songs are even better when the whole band plays them." George smiled, though his mind was still on Elena's diagnosis. "Why don't we take a break, Miguel? I need to talk to my manager for a bit." Mark had been simmering with barely contained frustration all day. When George pulled him into an empty office, the manager immediately launched into a litany of complaints. "The label president is furious, George. We've had to reschedule the entire promotional campaign. The photographer charged us anyway for the cancelled session. The charity gala people are claiming we breached contract by your no-show, and—" "Mark," George interrupted calmly, "I'm going to need you to set up a medical trust fund." Mark blinked. His tirade derailed. "A what?" "A medical trust fund. And for Elena Oliveira and her son." A long silence followed as Mark stared at George like he'd grown a second head. "The woman you met yesterday? The illegal immigrant with the blind kid?" George's expression hardened at Mark's tone. "Yes, her son's name is Miguel. He's 8 years old, plays piano by ear better than most trained adults, and has been standing in traffic selling tissues to help pay for his mother's medical bills." Mark ran a hand through his thinning hair. "George, I understand you feel sorry for them, but this isn't like donating to your usual charities. This is getting personally involved with an irregular immigration situation. Have you thought about the potential publicity issues?" "I'm not doing this for publicity," George replied evenly. "That's my point. If you want to help underprivileged kids, we can set up a proper foundation, get good press, tax benefits." "This isn't about tax benefits, Mark," George cut in, his voice taking on the quiet steel that those close to him recognized as unshakable resolve. "This is about doing what's right for a family that's suffered enough." Mark recognized the look. He'd managed George Strait for over 20 years and knew when the singer had made up his mind. Still, as his manager, he had to try. "At least let me have our lawyers look at this situation before you commit to anything. There could be complications we haven't considered." George nodded, a small concession. "Fair enough, but I want them working on solutions, not excuses." Later that afternoon, George took Miguel to visit his mother at the hospital again. When they arrived, they found Elena in tears, clutching a discharge notice. "They're sending me home tomorrow," she explained, despair evident in her voice. "The social worker says without insurance they can't keep me longer. I still feel so weak. How will I work? How will I take care of Miguel?" George placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Elena, I've had my doctor review your case. We're making arrangements for your continued treatment. Elena shook her head firmly. Mr. Strait, you've been incredibly kind, but I cannot accept such charity. We barely know each other. It's not charity, George insisted. He paused, searching for the right words. Let's call it an investment in Miguel's future as a musician. Mama, Miguel interjected, perching on the edge of her hospital bed, you should have heard me today in the studio. I played with real musicians on a real piano. Mr. Strait says I'm a natural. Elena's expression softened at her son's excitement, but her pride remained a formidable barrier. George recognized it, the same stubborn dignity that had kept her working 3 jobs rather than asking for handouts, that had her son selling tissues rather than simply begging. Their conversation was interrupted when Douglas Fuller from Children's Services entered the room, his pinched expression souring further at the sight of George. Ms. Oliveira, Fuller began without greeting, I've come to discuss the temporary placement options for Miguel while you're indisposed. Elena's face drained of color. What? No, I'm being discharged tomorrow. Miguel stays with me and my mother. Fuller adjusted his glasses with an air of bureaucratic inevitability. According to your medical report, you'll require significant recovery time and ongoing treatment. Given your immigration status and limited resources, we have concerns about Miguel's supervision and care during this period. George straightened to his full height, stepping slightly in front of Elena's bed. Mr. Fuller, as I mentioned yesterday, Elena has support now. There's no need for temporary placement. Fuller's lips thinned. With all due respect, Mr. Strait, celebrity interventions don't change established protocols. Unless Ms. Oliveira can demonstrate a stable home environment with appropriate supervision for a child with special needs, the department must consider temporary placement options. Miguel, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. I don't have special needs. I just can't see. I can do everything else. The simple dignity in the boy's statement hung in the air, momentarily silencing everyone. Fuller recovered first, clearing his throat. Nevertheless, the hearing is scheduled for Monday morning. I suggest you all be prepared to present any evidence of changed circumstances at that time. With a curt nod, he left the room. Once Fuller was gone, Elena broke down, pulling Miguel into a fierce embrace. I can't lose you, Meofilio. I can't. George watched the pair, anger and determination building within him. He stepped into the hallway to make a call. Tom, it's George Strait. I need your help with something urgent. Yes, it's about that case I mentioned. The hearing's on Monday. I need everything you've got. Tom Davidson was one of Nashville's most respected attorneys, known for both his legal acumen and his discretion. George had used his services for decades, from contract negotiations to real estate deals. If anyone could navigate the complex intersection of immigration, family law, and bureaucracy, it was Tom. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Elena was discharged as scheduled, but instead of returning to her small apartment, George had arranged for her to be transferred to a private medical facility specializing in kidney disease. Rosa moved into a hotel nearby to be close to her daughter, while Miguel split his time between visiting his mother and, to his delight, accompanying George to various appointments. The singer cancelled several major commitments, ignoring Mark's increasingly frantic warnings about contractual obligations and potential damage to his professional relationships. George Strait had built enough goodwill over 4 decades in the music industry. He could afford to disappoint a few executives. On Sunday afternoon, the day before the hearing, George invited Miguel to his penthouse apartment. The boy's face was a study in wonder as his hands explored the space. The floor-to-ceiling windows, which George described in detail, the custom leather furniture, the collection of vintage guitars. This one's from 1952, George explained, guiding Miguel's hands to a particularly special Martin guitar. It was the first really good guitar I ever owned. Miguel ran his fingers reverently over the smooth wood. It feels like it has stories. It does, George agreed. Many stories. They sat together on the terrace overlooking the city, Miguel enjoying the warm breeze and the distant sounds of Nashville, while George prepared himself for a difficult conversation. "Miguel," he began carefully, "about tomorrow's hearing. Are they going to take me away from Mama?" the boy asked directly, his unseeing eyes somehow finding George's face. George considered sugarcoating the truth, but decided Miguel deserved honesty. "Some people think that might be best while your mom gets better, but my lawyer and I are going to do everything possible to make sure that doesn't happen." Miguel nodded solemnly. "Mr. Fuller doesn't like us. He thinks Mama is a bad mother because she's sick and because we don't have papers. Mr. Fuller is wrong," George said firmly. "Your mother is one of the strongest, most dedicated parents I've ever met. Will you play something for me?" Miguel asked suddenly, changing the subject with the mercurial quickness of childhood. "Something you wrote?" George picked up the Martins guitar, thinking for a moment before beginning the gentle opening chords of "I Cross My Heart," one of his most beloved ballads. As he sang about promises kept and enduring love, he watched Miguel's face. The boy listened with complete concentration, his expression suggesting he wasn't just hearing the words and music, but absorbing them at some deeper level. When George finished, Miguel was quiet for a long moment. "That song is about forever love, isn't it? Like Mama has for me." "Exactly like that," George agreed, touched by the boy's insight. "Will you come to court with us tomorrow?" Miguel asked, vulnerability creeping into his voice for the first time since George had met him. "Nothing could keep me away," George promised. Monday morning arrived with a tension that hung in the air like the prelude to a summer storm. George arrived at the courthouse in a simple dark suit, rather than his usual Western wear, wanting to project conventional respectability to the judge. Tom Davidson met them outside, briefcase in hand, exuding calm confidence. "We're as prepared as we can be," Tom assured George. "I've outlined 3 separate arguments against temporary removal." Inside, Elena sat rigidly in her wheelchair, still weak from her hospital stay, but determined to fight for her son. Miguel stood beside her, one hand resting on her shoulder, the other gripping his cane. Rosa completed their small family unit, her weathered face a mask of worry. When Fuller arrived with his department attorney, he did a double take at the sight of Tom Davidson. The social worker's confident demeanor faltered slightly. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Patricia Hammond entered. In her 60s, with silver hair and penetrating eyes, she had a reputation for fairness but strict adherence to protocol. "Case number 752J, Department of Children's Services regarding Miguel Oliveira," the clerk announced. Fuller presented the department's case first, highlighting Elena's undocumented status, her medical condition, the grandmother's limited mobility, and Miguel's special needs as a visually impaired child. He emphasized Miguel's endangered behavior, selling tissues in traffic, and the family's financial instability. "Your Honor," Fuller concluded, "while we recognize the emotional bonds at play, the department believes temporary placement in a specialized foster home would best serve Miguel's interests while his mother focuses on her recovery." Judge Hammond turned to Tom. "Counselor?" Tom Davidson rose smoothly. "Your Honor, we're not disputing that this family has faced significant challenges. What we dispute is the assertion that separation is in Miguel's best interest. In fact, we believe it would cause unnecessary trauma to a child who has already demonstrated remarkable resilience." He outlined the arrangements George had made: Elena's specialized medical care, adequate housing, and a support system that would ensure Miguel's proper supervision while maintaining his vital connection to his family. Furthermore, Tom continued, my client, Mr. George Strait, is prepared to serve as Miguel's temporary guardian during Elena's recovery period, should the court deem additional oversight necessary. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Fuller's mouth fell open in shock. Even Elena turned to George with wide, questioning eyes. This was a development he hadn't discussed with her. Judge Hammond raised an eyebrow. Mr. Strait, please approach the bench. George walked forward, maintaining a respectful demeanor. Are you fully aware of what you're offering, Mr. Strait? The judge asked quietly. Guardianship, even temporary, is not a celebrity endorsement or charity project. It's a serious legal responsibility. I understand completely, Your Honor, George replied. I've raised a son of my own. I know what it means to be responsible for a child. Judge Hammond studied him for a long moment. And why would you do this for a family you've known less than a week? George considered his answer carefully. Because sometimes, Your Honor, the right thing to do is just clear. Miguel and his mother deserve a chance to stay together. I have the resources to help make that happen. It's as simple as that. As George returned to his seat, he caught Miguel's face turned toward him, an expression of amazed gratitude illuminating his features. In that moment, regardless of the judge's decision, George knew he had made the right choice. Judge Hammond's chambers had gone silent after George's statement. The veteran judge studied the unlikely group before her, the country music legend, the determined immigrant mother, the brave blind child, the concerned grandmother, and the increasingly uncomfortable social worker. Mr. Fuller, the judge finally said, while I appreciate the department's concerns, I'm not convinced that removal is in this child's best interest, especially given these new circumstances. She turned to Elena. Ms. Oliveira, are you comfortable with the arrangement Mr. Strait has proposed? Elena appeared overwhelmed, her eyes moving from George to Miguel and back. I don't know what to say. It is more generosity than anyone has ever shown us. It's not about generosity, George interjected gently. Miguel is a special kid, with extraordinary talent. I'm just making sure he gets the chance to develop it. Judge Hammond nodded thoughtfully. Here's my ruling. I'm denying the department's request for temporary removal. Instead, I'm approving a shared guardianship arrangement between Mrs. Oliveira and Mr. Strait for a period of 6 months, during which time regular assessments will determine if continued intervention is necessary. Fuller started to object, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. Furthermore, I'm ordering the department to provide this family with proper resources and support services, including adaptive equipment for Miguel and home healthcare assistance for Ms. Oliveira's recovery. She fixed Fuller with a pointed, "Look, this department exists to strengthen families, Mr. Fuller, not separate them at their most vulnerable moment." With a decisive bang of her gavel, the hearing concluded. Outside the courtroom, Elena grasped George's hand, tears streaming down her face. "How can we ever thank you?" she whispered. "You don't need to thank me," George replied. "Just focus on getting better, and maybe let me borrow your son for piano lessons now and then." Miguel, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the proceedings, suddenly hugged George around the waist. "Does this mean you're like my American dad now?" George chuckled, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Something like that, partner. Something like that." The next few months brought dramatic changes for the Oliveira family. With proper medical treatment, Elena's condition stabilized. Though she would always need medication and monitoring, her energy returned, and with it, her fierce independence. She insisted on taking English classes at the community college and learning computer skills that would allow her to work from home while caring for Miguel. George's immigration attorney worked diligently on their case, using a rare humanitarian provision to secure temporary legal status with a pathway to permanent residency. It wasn't a quick or easy process, but for the first time, the Oliveras had hope for a future without constant fear of deportation. Rosa blossomed once the weight of impending crisis lifted from her shoulders, with proper treatment for her arthritis. And a first-floor apartment in a building with an elevator, she began teaching Brazilian cooking classes at a local community center. Her pastéis de nata became legendary in the neighborhood, but it was Miguel who underwent the most remarkable transformation. George enrolled him in the prestigious Blair School of Music at Vanderbilt University for twice-weekly lessons. The boy's talent flourished under professional guidance, his repertoire expanding far beyond simple melodies to complex classical pieces and nuanced jazz arrangements. George kept his promise to include Miguel in his musical world. The boy became a regular presence at the recording studio, where engineers and session musicians took him under their collective wing. They adapted equipment with tactile markers so Miguel could begin learning the basics of sound engineering. The child who had once sold tissues in traffic now confidently navigated the complex console of a professional mixing board, guided by touch and his extraordinary ear. 4 months after the court hearing, George was preparing for his first concert tour since meeting the Oliveras. The morning of his Nashville show, he visited Elena at the family's new apartment, a spacious, accessible unit in a good neighborhood near Miguel's new school for visually impaired students. "You're coming tonight, right?" George confirmed as Elena served him coffee. "I've arranged special seating for all of you." Elena smiled, her face healthier and more relaxed than he'd ever seen it. "Wild horses couldn't keep us away. Miguel has been talking about nothing else for weeks." "Good," George nodded, sipping his coffee, "because I have a surprise planned." "Another surprise?" "George, you've already done so much." "This one's different," he interrupted with a mysterious smile. "Just make sure you're all there by 7. That evening, the Bridgestone Arena hummed with anticipation. The concert had sold out within hours of being announced. George Strait's first hometown show in over a year. Backstage, Miguel sat with George's band members, soaking in their pre-show rituals and jokes. "Nervous, kiddo?" the keyboard player asked, noticing Miguel's fingers drumming an unconscious rhythm on his knees. "A little," the boy admitted. "There will be so many people." "Don't worry about them," the musician advised. "When you're playing from your heart, it doesn't matter if it's one person listening or 20,000. The music knows where to go." Half an hour into the show, after performing several of his classic hits, George paused to address the crowd. "Folks, the next song is something special," he said, his voice echoing through the arena. "It's brand new, so new, in fact, that most of my team hasn't even heard it yet." A curious murmur spread through the audience. "About 4 months ago, I met someone who reminded me what music is really about," George continued. "Not record sales or awards, but connection, heart, soul. This song is called Seeing Through the Darkness, and I wrote it for a very special young man who taught me more about courage in a few days than I'd learned in 73 years. The crowd fell silent as George began to play, his rich voice filling the arena with lyrics that told the story of a blind boy selling tissues in the sun, whose courage opened the eyes of a man who could see everything except what truly mattered. In the front row, Elena clutched Rosa's hand as tears streamed down both their faces. Miguel sat between them, back straight, face tilted up toward the sound, absorbing every word and note with intense concentration. As George reached the final chorus, he paused, looking toward the side of the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite a special guest to join me. Please welcome Miguel Oliveira." A spotlight illuminated the stage entrance, where a stagehand was guiding Miguel forward. The audience erupted in applause as the small figure in a new Western-style shirt and boots made his way carefully to center stage. George knelt briefly to whisper something to Miguel, then led him to the grand piano. Without hesitation, Miguel found the keys and began to play, picking up the melody exactly where George had left off. His small fingers moved with surprising confidence as he added harmonies and embellishments that complemented George's guitar perfectly. 20,000 people fell completely silent, mesmerized by the blind boy playing with his whole heart. In the front row, Elena covered her mouth with her hands, overwhelming pride and joy radiating from her tear-streaked face. When the song ended, the arena erupted in thunderous applause. Miguel stood beside George, beaming with happiness as the singer placed a protective arm around his shoulders. "Ladies and gentlemen, remember this name, Miguel Oliveira," George announced. "Someday you'll be buying tickets to see him." The crowd roared their approval. Miguel bowed in the direction of the sound, his smile radiating pure joy. Backstage, after the concert, Elena embraced her son tightly. "Você foi incrível, meu filho. Incredible." "Did you like the song, Mama?" Miguel asked eagerly. "Mr. George let me help with some of the piano parts." "It was the most beautiful song I've ever heard," Elena assured him, looking over his head to George with eyes full of gratitude. Mark, George's manager, approached with an unusual look of contrition. "I have to admit, George, I was wrong. That kid brought down the house tonight. The label president is already talking about special guest appearances on the tour." George raised an eyebrow. "Only if it works with Miguel's school schedule. Education comes first." The following morning, country music news outlets and social media were buzzing with videos and stories about the blind boy prodigy who had shared the stage with George Strait. Offers for interviews and appearances flooded Mark's office, but George firmly protected the Oliveiras from the sudden spotlight, allowing only a single carefully managed story in a respected music magazine. As summer turned to fall, life settled into a new rhythm for the Oliveira family. Elena's health continued to improve, though her doctors warned she would always need to be careful. She found work as a Portuguese translator for an online education company, allowing her to earn a living while working from home. With George's endorsement, Rosa's cooking classes became so popular she had to add additional sessions. Miguel thrived in his new school, making friends for the first time with other visually impaired children. His music teachers marveled at his progress, one even comparing him to a young Stevie Wonder. Twice a month, he spent weekends at George's farm outside Nashville, where the singer had converted part of his home studio into a learning space adapted for Miguel's needs. On a crisp October evening, George hosted a small gathering at his farm to celebrate Elena's birthday. As everyone enjoyed Rosa's authentic Brazilian feast on the back porch, Miguel slipped away to the studio. A few minutes later, the soft sounds of a piano drew the adults' attention. They followed the music to find Miguel at the piano, playing a Brazilian song Elena had often sung to him as a lullaby. The boy had arranged it himself, transforming the simple melody into something rich and complex that still retained its emotional core. "I've been practicing," Miguel explained when he finished, sensing their presence. "It's Mama's present!" Elena knelt beside the piano bench, pulling her son into a tight embrace. "It's the most beautiful gift I've ever received." Later, as George walked Elena back to the guest house where she and Miguel were staying for the weekend, she paused to look up at the star-filled Tennessee sky. "Sometimes I still can't believe how our lives have changed," she said quietly. 6 months ago, I was in a hospital bed, terrified of losing Miguel. Now, she gestured to the beautiful property around them. Now this feels like a dream. "Not a dream," George corrected gently. "Just the life you and Miguel always deserved." "You know, when Miguel first lost his sight completely," Elena said, "I was devastated. I kept thinking of all the things he would never see, sunsets, mountains, the ocean, but Miguel told me something I'll never forget. He said, "Mama, I can still see everything important, just with my heart instead of my eyes." George nodded, understanding. That's a wisdom most adults never achieve. When you found him that day, Elena continued, Miguel was trying to save me, but in truth, you both ended up saving each other, didn't you? George considered her words, thinking back to the emptiness he'd felt before meeting Miguel, the disconnection from his music and his purpose. I suppose we did, he acknowledged. The following spring, George invited the Oliveras to his ranch in Texas. Miguel, now 9, had grown taller and more confident, though he retained the same earnest determination that had first caught George's attention. One evening, George took Miguel horseback riding, the boy securely seated in front of him on his gentlest quarter horse. As they walked slowly along the perimeter of the property, George described everything around them, the wildflowers beginning to bloom, the distant hills, the cattle grazing in the pasture. "Can I tell you a secret, Mr. George?" Miguel asked. His face turned up to catch the gentle breeze. "Of course, partner." "Sometimes I'm glad I can't see," Miguel confessed. "Because when people describe things to me, like you're doing now, it's like I get to see the world through their heart, not just their eyes. And that's a special kind of seeing." George felt a lump form in his throat. "That's a beautiful way of looking at it, Miguel. Mama says that music is like that too. It lets people see into your heart without using their eyes." "Your mama is a very wise woman," George agreed. As they turned the horse back toward the stable, Miguel spoke again. "Mr. George, thank you for seeing me that day. Most people looked right past me." George tightened his arms slightly around the boy, who had unexpectedly changed his life. "Miguel, meeting you was the best thing that's happened to me in a very long time, so I should be thanking you." The Texas sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks as they rode home, George describing the colors to Miguel, who translated them into musical terms. Fiery oranges became bold trumpet notes. Soft pinks turned into gentle piano arpeggios. Together, they composed a sunset symphony, bridging their different ways of experiencing the world through the universal language of music. As the stable came into view, George realized with sudden clarity that Norma would have loved Miguel, would have recognized, as he had, the extraordinary spirit within this ordinary boy. Somewhere, he felt certain, she was smiling her approval. "You know, Miguel," George said as he helped the boy dismount, "I think this is the beginning of a beautiful partnership." Miguel's face lit up with a radiant smile. "Music partners. Music partners," George confirmed, extending his hand for Miguel to shake. The boy found it unerringly, his grip firm and confident. The handshake of someone who knew exactly where he was going, even in darkness. Together, they walked toward the house where Elena and Rosa waited on the porch, silhouetted against the golden Texas evening. 2 generations of Oliveras and a country music legend bound together by chance, courage, and the healing power of music. As Miguel ran ahead, his cane tapping a confident rhythm on the path, George Strait, the king of country, watched with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had rediscovered his purpose in the most unexpected place. At a traffic light, on a hot Nashville afternoon, through the courage of a blind boy who had taught him to truly see,